on this 74th Independence Day. I, Siddharth Arora, member of Legal Desire Student Division team, along with Mr. Ijaz Mohammed, Human Rights Department Head, welcome you all for the discussion on General Comment 37 on Right to Peaceful Assembly, Article 21 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Today, we have with us Mr. Sarthak Roy. Sarthak Roy, sir, is a research officer at the Office of International Director for the Commonwealth Human Rights Initiative. Sarthak Roy is one of the authors for the Easier Said Than Done series, which provides a basis for evaluating Commonwealth countries' engagement with the UNHRC. Sir has graduated from School of Law, Christ University in 2018 with a specialization in international law. At law school, Sarthak sir was a teaching assistant for the public international law course and authored degree dissertation titled A Critical Analysis of the Preemptory Status on the Prohibition on the Use of Force under the United Nations System. Sarthak sir has many publications under his name. We welcome you, sir, and thank you so much for joining us today. Now, I would like Mr. Ijaz Mohammed. Thank you, sir. Now, I would like Mr. Ijaz Mohammed to kindly welcome him.
Happy Independence to each and everyone. I just moment as part of the Human Rights Department of Legal Desire would wholeheartedly welcome Mr. Sarthak Roy as well as my team member Siddharth Arora. So we plan to move in with the session, and Mr. Sarthak Roy, kindly start with the session.
Thank you everyone for this wonderful invite on a very special day, which is the Independence Day. So I'm going to be giving a brief overview and having an interactive session with you all and maybe the audience if they want to join in regarding the right to peaceful assembly, which is enshrined not only under Article 21 of the UN Charter, under the ICCPR, but as well as in the constitutional provisions of India as well. And on this very important day, it is pertinent that a discussion regarding right to peaceful assembly and the general comment which came in on the July 29th is very important. So to begin with, as to what the right to peaceful assembly general comment spoke about, I'll just give a brief outline for the viewers to have a good understanding of what the work of general committees in general are. So one has to understand that there are 10 human rights committees which are present, and each and every human rights committee presents its general comments or interpretive guidance, as it's called, regarding specific provisions under the ICCPR and other UN treaty bodies. For example, the committees are comprised of independent experts and in general carry out three primary functions. One is examine the state party reports on compliance with treaty obligations and adopt concluding observations in respect of them. Number two, adopt views in response to individual communications alleging treaty violations. And number three, adopt general comments or general recommendations. This flows from Human Rights Committee's works, where I'm going to be focusing on general comment number 37. So before I get into that, it needs to be also understood that general comments are very much central to understanding the human rights treaty obligations and have been described by many scholars as an indispensable source of treaty interpretation. Although let me clarify it to all the viewers and law students out there that this does not have a binding obligation to be followed. However, it acts as an interpretive guidance in order to analyze and understand the treaty mechanisms better. Like in this case, the ICCPR provision on right to peaceful assembly, which has a mention under Article 21 of the ICCPR, but over here under the general comment, it has been expounded to understand its various nuances. So now, what is right to peaceful assembly? So, right to peaceful assembly has in this general comment has both a positive dimension as well as a negative dimension. So, what is the positive component? The positive component of the right to peaceful assembly is that there should not be any undue state interference into the rights of peaceful assembly. And the negative it was the negative component is that there should not be any undue interference. And the positive component is states should facilitate the exercise and the right and protect participants when they take part in peaceful assembly. So In this aspect of peaceful assembly, it is very important that this general comment is coming at a time when there are widespread and massive protests around the world which is going on. We all can see what's happening in Belarus with the whole Lukashenko presidential candidate elections, what's happening in Beirut and Lebanon right after the assembly blast, which led to the cabinet itself resigning. And it has been happening in India for some time since the whole CAA protests that erupted, since the Kashmir situation that came up. So there are protests going all over the world, and many of these protests are witnessing excessive use of force by law enforcement, which coincided with even the global pandemic, which is ongoing currently right now. So it has to be understood. I'll give some snapshots from the general comment itself. So accordingly, the right of protest is protected, and it is under para 6 of this new general comment, which is enshrined that the right of protest is protected, and the fact that agents or provocators or other individuals within an assembly, even if they try to create some nuisance, even if they try to resort to violence, this does not, and it's very explicit, this does not justify the banning of all demonstrations or ongoing demonstrations. Yes, law enforcement officials also have a role to play, but primarily facilitating and protecting demonstrations. And no demonstration does not lose its peaceful nature merely because if its participants contest in some measures which is illegal or they resort to some form of violence. So there is a very wonderfully crafted uh, committee decision which is made pertaining to curtailment of any sort of violent assemblies. So what they have done is that they have specifically mentioned that there needs to be a sense of necessity and proportionality in terms of in terms of curtailing any sort of violence. There cannot be a blanket ban on assemblies. There cannot be massive violence on the complete assembly as such. It needs to be, the balance needs to be, there should be a sense of proportionality which affects the state of the art in the development of the doctrine. For example, restrictions have to be proportionate, and I quote, which requires a value assessment weighing the nature and detrimental impact of the interference on the exercise of right against the resultant benefit to the one on the grounds for interfering. If the detriment outweighs the benefit, then only the restriction is disproportionate and thus not permissible. So there needs to be an assessment in this regard, which the police enforcement or the law enforcement, which is at the sidelines of the assembly, needs to undertake. So there are three instances whereby some sort of violence or where the law enforcement can step in properly. And the three instances are: number one, if there is a concrete proof of incitement of violence, there needs to be a concrete proof. It cannot be mere hearsay. Secondly, there should be concrete proof that there is an intention to use violence. It might not have happened yet, but there is an intention which is present. And finally, violence is imminent. So you see, this is how wonderfully the committee has assured that there needs to be some sort of necessity, legality, distinction, precautions, and most importantly, proportionality in terms of curtailing right to peaceful assemblies or assemblies at large. So I'll give you some brief overviews of what this right to peaceful assembly under this, which is the 37th general comment of the Human Rights Committee addresses. The first aspect of the general comment addresses is the scope of protection and what would entail obligations on the state. The document is very clear, let me tell you. An assembly that is peaceful falls within the scope of protection, covering coordinated as well as spontaneous gatherings. And let me also remind that this extension of General Assembly, right to peaceful assembly, is also extended to assemblies online as well as offline. So this is a very new addition that it has been added online as well. And thus, the highlight is also the fact that this general comment has focused on issues pertaining to technology. So hence, technology that would facilitate these gatherings may not be curtailed. Like we have seen that during the outbreak of the pandemic in China, obviously we know that in China there's a lot of curtailment of this basic human rights provisions. So it so happened that citizens were trying to gather online on Zoom call like we are speaking right now, or Microsoft Teams. But what Chinese government did, they tried to curtail those internet services. With this, general comment states very clearly assemblies online cannot also be curtailed like that by the governments at large. The Human Rights Committee, as I mentioned earlier, has very wonderfully spoken about police action and use of force in various details, specifically in terms of curtailment of such sort of assemblies which might go out of bounds, and then there is an incitement of violence, which is unique in the fact that it has not really addressed in such manner in previous drafts of the General Comment number 37. And now speaking about general comments in General Comment number 37 regarding the right to peaceful assembly, there is one important point I wanted to highlight, which was raised over here. Uh, the fact that peaceful assemblies, and it is something which Christoph Heinz, Christoph Heinz is the person who led the General Comment. He was a special rapporteur of the Human Rights Committee who led the formation and drafting of the General Comment. And he mentions very explicitly, and in one of his interviews right after this General Comment came up, that peaceful assemblies have been able to topple authoritarian governments more than violent reactions. So according to his study, and according to the study by two very important authors, they looked at various demonstrations around the world and the history of demonstrations at large. They saw that peaceful assemblies are twice as successful in terms of bringing about social change in comparison with violent resistance. And in the longer term, the likelihood of having violence is much smaller if the transition has been relatively peaceful. And what is interesting is that in Sudan, in Algeria, even during the Balkans, and especially during the fall of Slobodan Milosevic, it all came to an end through political and thorough demonstrations, peaceful demonstrations, and not violent outbursts, which is an interesting anecdote because we generally tend to think that unless and until you violently react to some sort of authoritarian regime, they will not be stepping down. But as clearly facts on the ground show that peaceful assemblies is so sacrosanct in terms of privileging our constitutional values, our international values, that it needs to be taken note of. That peaceful assemblies is the way forward. So now there are various definitions of peaceful assemblies which have been provided throughout the time. I will highlight a few definitions for the sake of viewers and for all the listeners over here. So the UN Special Rapporteur on Peaceful Assembly has defined an assembly as an intentional and temporary gathering in a private or public space for specific purpose. However, the General Comment, which is in place right now, has a different take on it. The General Comment, in its revised draft published in November 2019, has proposed a very simple and an amended provision, which is namely a gathering of persons with a common purpose in a space. That's it. That's what the General Comment's basic understanding of assembly. Now, there might be questions as to what is the difference between an assembly, because it's very important to understand the intersectional detachments or decoupling as well. For example, what is the difference between an assembly and an expression and protests or demonstrations for that matter? So the difference lies on 5 facets, if I have to build it up. So the 5 definitional elements whereby a peaceful assembly differs from expression and protest is: number 1, numerosity. In an assembly, there needs to be more than one person who can be part of an assembly. There needs to be a number. Participation. There needs to be a thorough mental element of participation going into the General Assembly. For example, people standing at a bus stop is not equivalent to an assembly. There is no right to assembly while standing at a bus stop because there is not a sense of participation, which leads me to the third element, which is intentionality. There needs to be an intention as to why you're standing at one particular place and trying to talk about something or demonstrating something, which leads to my fourth point, which is purpose. What is the purpose of your assembly? There needs to be some sense of purpose. And finally, there needs to be a space and place. Like I mentioned, this assembly very rightly detaches differentiates between the fact that assembly can be both online as well as offline. So I think these are the very important salient points of this General Comment, which is important and commendable because not much conversation has been had at least in the Indian aspect, considering that Indians are so much, we believe in our politics, we believe in our constitutional values. Yes, there have been abuses, but it's also pertinent and important that such international provisions, guidance notes, and protections is something which is valued and cherished by us if we have to go forward and being a part of this participating in this whole political process, despite not being in politics directly, but being as concerned citizens of this country. We, and especially on this Independence Day, it's a solemn pledge that I wish that we understand these nuances of fundamental rights, which is enshrined not only in our constitutions, as I highlighted, but in the international provisions to which India is a treaty body to, including the ICCPR, to which India has ratified the ICCPR. So I will finish my initial comments over here right now, and I can see that I've spoken a little bit at length, and I will be happy to address some more questions in the interactive session forward.
Thank you so much, sir. That was quite a bit detailed comment, and that was truly insightful. And we were happy to hear you. So we have some questions over here. So I would like to ask the first question. That is, India hasn't signed the ICCPR yet, but it has exceeded the same. So what can be the possible reasoning for this, and what are the effects of it?
So we have to I mean, before going to the possible reasons, and I'll also highlight that India's drafters like Hansa Mehta and Vijay Lakshmi Pandit, right after India's independence, during their representation at the United Nations itself, they were very much a part of the creation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is a landmark document, which is like more than 70 years old by now. So from there, in the participation of the UDHR on various provisions, and in a recent webinar I had spoken about it, in various provisions, India has made participation where they remove all men are born equal and XYZ2 human beings are born equal. There's issues relating to color, caste, discrimination, which was very wonderfully dovetailed into the document of UDHR. Now, when it comes to throughout and this is born from the fear that there might be some sort of sovereignty problem which can come through because of being part of some treaties, but not other countries of the human rights treaty bodies. For example, the Convention Against Torture, which me and mentioned, we have been promoting to ratify the United Nations Convention Against Torture. So these are the provisions which India has been very reticent, is because of that. I think there's a traditional fear that this whole treaty bodies or the UN mechanism is a Western concept which might make undue internal interferences, or it might also be that states which are not valuing India, not, I shouldn't call them as enemies, but states which are really not with India in terms of our philosophy, in terms of our culture, might in this treaty board and try to hold India to task, which might which can pose some uncomfortable questions to the government.
Roy, they have taken an active measure to safeguard fundamental rights, freedoms, especially in our country.
There is no with that India is 74 years after its independence, right? So over here, we cannot just be dilly-dallying our obligations going forward, especially since this current government. We are hearing talks like, Indo-Pacific alliances in order to combat the outreach of China or to combat Pakistan's influence, right? So over here, what is important is that we also show that we are also true global leaders who would like to uphold international values, and especially values such as human rights, which are enshrined in our constitution as well as the UN Charter. And obviously, it's important and pertinent that being a leader in human rights in the region will also lead to many countries looking up to us as examples and as coalition partners in this whole proposed coalition of democracy, which is something which is coming up through the ranks. And we need to demonstrate that we are different from authoritarian regimes. We are not going to be authoritarian regimes because on this day and age, I'm proud to call that our freedom fighters have struggled for this, gave their blood not to see an authoritarian regime coming up in a diverse, multilingual, multicultural country like India. It's important that we value each and everyone's opinion, and yet we demonstrate our opposition in a meaningful and useful manner. And thus, it's pertinent for India as a proposed global leader and as someone who is part of the UN Security Council for the next 2 years and someone who harbors ambitions of being a permanent member to uphold these human rights treaty bodies and regimes to which even if they're not signed to it, but they have also shown their proposed plans of signing in the near future.
So we have another question. As you mentioned, Christoph Haynes is a special rapporteur for the General Comment 37. So in his comment, he has stated that the choice of the venue or location of an assembly by the organizers is an integral part of the right to freedom of peaceful assembly. And in the comment by the National Human Rights Commission of India on General Comment 37, they have specifically stated that for protecting the sovereignty and integrity as well as the public order, the state authorities many a time designate particular areas and routes, dedicating them for the purpose of holding public meetings. So, from both these comments, the contradiction direct us to the question whether such restrictions provide the freedom to restrict them to a specific location to lessen the impact.
Right. So, I mean, it needs to be understood that there needs to be there is a dichotomy between what the special rapporteur Christoph Heinz has mentioned and what the National Human Rights Council, Human Rights Institution in India in its comments have spoken about. So if you're talking about restricting it to a particular space and place, yes, one of the criterion for understanding peaceful assembly, like I had mentioned, is space and place. A particular space and place is also important and pertinent. For example, you cannot be hosting an assembly in front of an hospital. You cannot be hosting an assembly on the street which joins some sort of highways or something like that. So an important delineation is also important in terms of space, and it cannot be anywhere and everywhere. It needs to be at public spaces. No one's denying it. Public spaces. For example, we have seen that in Delhi during the whole Anna Hazare movement, there was a Ramlila Maidan which was. So you see, there is an allocation of public spaces, which I think is right, which is undeniably important, because in a country, not everything we accede to or we accept at the international front need to be implemented in identically in a country. We have a right to make our own decisions and to implement it in a way which can be purposive and which will be which will see the whole inherent object and purpose being fulfilled. For that matter, I feel it's absolutely important that the delineation of space and place is also important, considering our population, considering the sensitivities of our people, considering the multilingual or multicultural aspects of our citizen. So I think it's important, and it's a good suggestion given by the National Human Rights Institution, like in the NHRC in India, that there needs to be some sort of delineation and cannot be anywhere and everywhere. Having said that, though, there is a big criticism of the NHRC currently, because in the whole Jamia Millia protest that happened, there has not been clear-cut, proper investigations being carried out. And I do not, and my views, please, I mean, for everyone, is not on behalf of my organization. These are my personal views. I feel the NHRC, which can hold truth to the power, is failing to do so, and it needs to come up with some sort of plausible measures in order to bettering its work and in order to treasure such international human rights principles within our domestic jurisdiction.
Yes, I think also exactly. These are some of my views also, because in our country, most of the
I'm sorry,
when a
Ijaz,
piece of
I cannot. I mean, your voice is again cutting off. I don't know if there's
can you
any
hear
kind
me?
of. No, I don't know why. Siddharth, can you speak and can I hear you?
Hello.
Uh, Hello, Sarthak sir, can you hear me?
No, 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 I cannot hear you. Just hold the recording once more. Probably let me leave and then join back.
All
Would it
right.
be okay?
Sh-
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
sure.
Okay.
I'm just doing that.
So the basically, yeah. So the basically one thing is that I feel that most of the cases when it comes to the protests, governments don't hesitate to get charge cases against these protesters, and there won't be no sufficient investigations. And such international standards should be complied, but I don't know how effective or how much effective it can be complied in our country, because it's a common scenario in almost every part of the state, our country, that people are being arrested or just for being participating in a protest.
Right. So that's this boils down to my view and assertion that India should not be resembling any sort of authoritarian state or an autocratic state. Especially since we are talking about our freedoms, we are expressing our freedoms on social media. We are registering our protests on social media. Now we have to understand that the guardians of these constitutional provisions as well as international obligations does not flow from the executive particularly, because the primary guardian is our courts. Our courts need to take absolute cognizance of such situations and even files and be little bit interventionist and activist in its nature sometimes, in order to ensure that such freedoms and such cherished obligations internationally is protected for that matter. So it's the executive at large is there, but like the idea of checks and balances flows from the fact that the other limbs of the government, which is the judiciary as well, needs to embark upon this interventionist mindset in terms of protecting its fundamental basic freedoms, which is not only in our constitution but also on the international platform. And now is the time of internationalism. Now is the time of internationalization of human rights. Now is the time for the walk towards universalization of human rights. And I know it's a little contrary to the current world global scenario. It is not a multipolar world. It is a unipolar world sort of a situation. Globalization is being affected. But should that mean that everything is going to be tarnished? Not at all. I mean, as one professor, Martin Paprinskis, has once recently written about, that the basic fundamentals of international law and human rights law are still stable. It is just that we have to look towards it and seek our inspiration, because throughout the ages, international law did not fall from the sky. It fell from difficult times. It fell from the times when there was the Spanish Civil War, when we had the writings of Gentili, Hugo Grotius, during very in a war ravaged times. So it was born from difficult times. But right now we feel it is a difficult and time where it is not the time of the 90s when there was a lot of globalization, but it's not the end. I'm not going to predict that it's the end or the twilight of human rights, which many people are addressing it as. There is still a time, there's still a scope for hope, because if you look around, as much as we see Donald Trump or Netanyahu or Lukashenko in all these countries, equally we see someone like Jacinda Ardern. We see other fantastic advocates for human rights, like even Angela Merkel, then the French President Macron. So there are also inspirations we need to draw from, and there are internationalists as well as interventionists. So it's important that we choose which side we are
So I just have one last question for you. In
on. Yes.
the first draft of the General Comment 37, it has been stated that the right to freedom of peaceful assembly and of association serve as a vehicle for the exercise of many other civil, cultural, economic, political, and social rights are
Right.
essential in the implementation process of Agenda 2030 on sustainable development. So, what are
Right.
your views on this?
So it's absolutely true. Like I mentioned, it's obviously it's been very difficult for for the Human Rights Committee itself to disentangle assembly from expression and from association, for that matter. So assembly, association, expression, core fundamental principles and obligations are very much interlinked. For example, I'll give you a very important anecdote. The Human Rights Committee, has emphasized that the interdependence of expression and assembly has found concurrent violations of right to freedom of expression, which is enshrined under Article 19 of the ICCPR, and the right to freedom of assembly under Article 21 in more than 30 cases so far. So you see, there is, so you cannot, as long they are not, these fundamental principles are not islands in exclusivity, if I have to mention that. They are all mutually dependent on each other. So therefore, the general comment for that matter has what it has found out is absolutely right. There are so many provisions which is like, for example, these are the fundamental entangled provisions. Now, for example, when there is some sort of force being used, there's some sort of unlawful force being used, then right to life is also a prejudice. Right to life is prejudice. Like right to movement is prejudice for that matter. So I think it's we need to understand and see that these fundamental, there is no one choice or one size fits all sort of a provision. We have to understand that these rights are very much codependent on each other, and for its fruitful functioning, if one limb of it falls, the other will be affected as well. So that's why I think it's the general comment has made a wonderful. And by the way, there's a very interesting anecdote that this general comment, for the first time, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, for the first time it has happened that a general comment has come through after negotiations happening online. Especially, otherwise, it always happens at the Human Rights Council when the Human Rights Committee meets yearly. But just like it has mentioned that assemblies are protected both offline as well as online. This is an interesting anecdote that this has happened, all happened online, and I thought it would be interesting for others to understand the use of technology in this age.
Thank you so much, sir. So, Ajas, sir, do you have any questions?
Yeah, I have one more question. The thing is that regarding the concept of online assembly. So what are these any particular requirements that constitute the concept of online assembly? Because I don't think we can, there might be a lot of protests among the world on a particular issue, since digital platform has no boundaries as such. There is no geographical boundaries as such. So it is worldwide. So is there any pre-requirements for the constituting that?
Okay, that's a very interesting anecdote. Interesting question regarding online assembly. So let me make it clear that the General Assembly 37, although it has gone in depth in many aspects, did not absolutely delineate the aspect of online assemblies. It has provided a benchmark principle, but now, according to my understanding and according to understanding the fact that there is a growth of business and human rights issues, there is a growth of technology and human rights issues. The online assemblies, like I had mentioned, and given an example, and I'll repeat it once more, that there cannot be any curtailment of the government when there are participants meeting online. Like, for example, if we three are meeting right now, it can be considered as an assembly because there's a meeting of more than one person for that. Now, if Indian government decides to ban Zoom calls or anything like that because of the fact that people are meeting online and trying to raise an issue or raising an awareness for that matter, that is not right. That is not right. But like you had mentioned, how can it be placed throughout and all across and all encompassing? So that's why you will see that Facebook, for that matter, recently has a board of advisors which are concerned with who include former human rights experts to understand what is the kind of content going up on Facebook, what is the kind of discussions happening on Facebook. No one's saying that your right to expression should be curtailed, but we have seen in this whole Rohingya issue as to how Facebook has been used as a tool to propagate hatred towards the Rohingyas in Myanmar. So much so that before the International Court of Justice, the whole issue of testimonies or files from Facebook itself is a question at large, and there are a lot of litigation going through to get hold of posts and so discussions which have been taken down by Facebook, which was being pushed around by the military junta of Myanmar. So I think what's important is that this technology companies, and these social media enterprises should realize that because it's this after coronavirus world right now we are living in, whereby our dependence would be even more on online meetings and discussions. So I think in their general provisions or some sort of terms of reference when they enter a market, they need to uphold such human rights provisions, because business and human rights, a treaty is also in the making. I know, and I know people who are trying to negotiate a universal treaty, just like the ICCPR, UDHR, and everything. A business and human rights treaties which needs to be adhered to and enshrined in the workings of various companies.
Yeah, it's true actually. Even when Edward Snowden's case was up, all around the world, it was a big issue, as well as
Ijaz,
there was.
Ijaz, I'm really sorry. I
Yeah.
just don't know why this Zoom is creating
Uh,
this much trouble. I hope you can hear me, but I cannot hear you. So I
yeah.
think it's the same. It's going to be
Are
with
you able to hear me now?
why is this happening? Uh, I think Siddharth, can you just stop it? I'll again leave and just join. Yes, you were asking a question. Yeah.
Yeah, it's actually like Edward Snowden's case when it was exposed. Everyone was protesting, even through online as well as offline.
Right.
So yeah, okay. Is there anything else?
No, sir, I don't think so. It was pretty much clear. And it was truly an insightful brief.
Okay. I would like to thank Mr. Sarthak Roy for taking his time out of his busy schedule for giving us an insight on this great topic. And thank you so much for giving us your precious time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Team Legal Desire. Thank you to Ijaz and Siddharth for accommodating this time and on a very important date and a topic which I think is very important and pertinent for us to read and ponder and write about even more. Like students need to write about fundamental rights. They need to talk about fundamental rights and the discourses. And yes, our right to discuss and right to meet online is protected. So that's a great thing. And I hope such conversations go forward even better. Thank you
Yeah.
so much.
Thank you so
Thank
much,
you.
sir.